Imagine this. You wake up, your mind is already racing. Thoughts of work, responsibilities, expectations, they flood your mind the moment you open your eyes. But what if? Just what if, there was a way to quiet all that noise? What if you could control the thoughts that control you? We've all been there, caught in the chaos of our own minds, struggling with stress, negativity, confusion. But here's the thing, what if your thoughts didn't have to be your enemy? What if you could use them as a tool for peace, clarity, and wisdom? This is where right thinking comes in. In Buddhism, right thinking isn't just about thinking positive, it's about learning to think with clarity, with purpose, and with an open mind. It's about transforming the way we approach our thoughts, recognizing that the mind is the source of both our suffering and our happiness. Right thinking is part of the Noble Eightfold Path, a path to peace, freedom, and enlightenment. It's a practice that anyone, anywhere can begin to embrace. And it all starts with understanding the simple yet powerful idea that our thoughts shape everything. So, let me ask you, have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what's driving my thoughts? What's shaping my reality? Because, here's the truth, our thoughts are our reality. The way we think about ourselves, others, and the world around us, shapes how we feel, how we act, and ultimately, how we live, and this journey we're about to take together. It's not just some ancient philosophy, it's a way to live right here, right now. It's about making every thought, every moment, an opportunity to live with wisdom, so let's dive in. The path to right thinking begins now. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll see your thoughts in a completely new light. Let's take that first step. Let's take a moment. Close your eyes, if you can. Think back to a time when you felt stressed, anxious, or upset. Maybe it was today, or maybe it was years ago, but that feeling, that weight on your chest. It all started with a thought. It's fascinating, isn't it? How just one thought, one fleeting idea, can change your entire mood, your entire day, sometimes even your entire life. In Buddhism, we say that the mind is the root of all suffering, and also the root of all joy. It's the place where everything begins. Every moment of happiness, every moment of pain, starts right there in your mind. Now, think about this. How often do we get caught up in negative thoughts? Thoughts of fear, anger, frustration, jealousy. They seem to come out of nowhere, don't they? One moment, everything feels fine. The next, your mind is overwhelmed by a storm of negativity. But what if we could change that? What if we could learn to take control? The truth is, we're not our thoughts. Our thoughts don't define us. In fact, they're often fleeting, like clouds passing through the sky. Yet, we often hold on to them, allowing them to dictate our emotions, our actions, even our relationships. This is where suffering begins. When we allow our minds to dwell in fear, desire, or anger, we're feeding into a cycle of suffering that doesn't have to exist. We're letting our minds control us, rather than the other way around. But here's the breakthrough, our minds are also the source of our joy, peace, and wisdom. When we cultivate right thinking, when we choose to shift our thoughts toward clarity and compassion, we break free from the cycle of suffering. We create space for joy, understanding, and happiness to flourish. This is the power of the mind. It's not a passive force. It's active. It's alive. And it's in our control. But only if we're willing to take responsibility for what we think, for what we believe, and for how we see the world. Think about it this way, if we believe the world is full of dangers and people are untrustworthy, we'll live in fear. But if we choose to believe that the world is full of opportunity, kindness, and love, we'll see exactly that. Our mind creates our reality. And by changing how we think, we can change everything. So, ask yourself, what kind of thoughts are you holding on to? Are they thoughts that lead you to joy? Or are they holding you back, keeping you trapped in cycles of suffering? So now we understand. The mind is both the architect of suffering and the gateway to joy. But here's the big question: how do we begin to transform it? How do we stop the flood of negative, repetitive, chaotic thoughts? And start thinking clearly, wisely, peacefully? The answer lies in one powerful, ancient principle: purification of the mind. This is where the journey of right thinking truly begins. Imagine your mind as a mirror. Over the years, it gets covered with dust from old wounds, from fears passed down to you, from false beliefs and unresolved emotions. Most people go through life reacting to what they see in this dusty mirror, never realizing that the reflection isn't clear, it's distorted. Purification is not about forcing yourself to think positively, it's about gently cleaning the mirror, removing the dust, layer by layer, so that you can see clearly, so that your thoughts arise from truth, not illusion. Buddha taught that we are not bound by our past. No matter how many mistakes we've made, no matter how long we've carried our pain, transformation is always possible. But it starts with honesty, it starts with turning inward, observing our own minds, and asking, what thoughts am I feeding? Which ones bring peace? Which ones create suffering? This is the first step of purification, awareness, to become aware of what you're thinking. To notice, without judgment, the patterns that run your life. The second step is letting go of what no longer serves you: anger, envy, blame, guilt. These aren't flaws. They're mental habits. And habits can be unlearned, and the third step is replacing, not with fantasies, not with blind optimism, but with thoughts rooted in wisdom, compassion instead of judgment, patience instead of frustration, understanding instead of resentment. Think of it like gardening. Your mind is the soil. If you want to grow peace, you must remove the weeds. You must clear space for the seeds of right thinking to grow. And just like a garden, it takes time. Daily care. Gentle effort. No one becomes enlightened overnight. But each day, each moment that you bring awareness to your thoughts, you're already walking the path, so don't worry if your mind still feels messy. That's okay. The goal isn't perfection, the goal is presence, and purification is a lifelong process, a beautiful, sacred one. We've talked about purifying the mind, about becoming aware of the thoughts we carry, and slowly learning to let go of those that weigh us down, but now, we reach a turning point on this journey, a shift from cleansing the mind to opening it to wisdom, the kind that doesn't come from books or opinions, but from seeing clearly. From seeing things as they truly are. In Buddhism, wisdom isn't about being clever or educated, it's not about knowing more, it's about seeing deeper, because most of the time, what we see isn't reality, it's our version of it, filtered through fear, desire, memory, ego. Two people can experience the same moment, and walk away with two completely different realities. Why? Because they're not seeing the moment itself, they're seeing their thoughts about the moment. So let me ask you, when you look at your life, your job, your relationships, your self-worth, are you seeing what's actually there, or are you seeing a story you've been telling yourself? This is where wisdom begins, not with answers, but with honest observation, with the courage to look at life without distortion. The Buddha called this yatthadasana, seeing things as they actually are, not as we want them to be. Not as we fear them to be, but simply, clearly, truthfully. It's like washing a dirty window. The world doesn't change, the view was always there, but now you can see it. When you start seeing clearly, suffering begins to dissolve. You stop clinging to what isn't permanent. You stop chasing what doesn't bring true joy. You stop blaming others for your pain, and something incredible happens. You begin to respond, instead of react. You begin to understand, instead of assume. You begin to live with compassion, instead of conflict. This is the fruit of wisdom. It doesn't make life easier, it makes life clearer, and in clarity, peace is born. You might wonder, how do I start seeing clearly? Start by paying attention, noticing when your mind adds judgment, noticing when fear colors the moment, noticing the stories you tell yourself, then asking, is this true? Or just a habit of thought? Little by little, wisdom arises, and when it does, it transforms how you think, how you feel, and how you live, because wisdom isn't just knowing, it's seeing, and when you begin to see clearly, everything changes, even the things that don't. Now that we've explored the mind, purified its patterns, and tasted the clarity of wisdom, you might be wondering, how do I live this, day to day? Because it's one thing to understand right thinking in theory, but real transformation happens not in temples or retreat centers, it happens in traffic, in conversations, in the chaos of real life. Right thinking isn't about escaping the world, it's about walking through the world. With awareness, with intention, with peace. Let's make it practical. Scene 1. In the morning, you wake up. Before reaching for your phone, you pause, you take a single conscious breath, and instead of letting your mind wander into stress or comparison, you choose a seed thought. Today, I will respond, not react. Today, I will return to presence. This is right thinking, beginning your day with clarity, not chaos. Scene 2. At work, a coworker criticizes your work unfairly. Your mind flares up, how dare they? They always do this. But then, you catch it, you recognize the emotion arising. You see the old narrative creeping in, you breathe, you return to wisdom. This is just a thought, I don't have to believe it, I can choose peace over pride. That moment, that shift, is right thinking in action. You see, it's not about suppressing your emotions, it's about seeing them clearly. And choosing not to let them control you. Scene 3, with family or loved ones, someone you love is struggling. Maybe they're angry, distant, or hurting. Your old pattern might be to fix, to control, to take it personally. But with right thinking, you pause, you listen, you offer presence instead of pressure. You understand that their suffering isn't an attack on you, it's a call for compassion. That's wisdom. That's mindfulness, that's right thinking, with a heart. Throughout your day, these moments are everywhere, moments to choose love over fear, clarity over confusion, reality over assumption. Even the mundane becomes sacred, washing the dishes becomes a meditation, waiting in line becomes a chance to breathe, a tough conversation becomes a doorway to growth, because right thinking doesn't mean avoiding difficulty, it means meeting it, with presence and purpose. Let this be your practice. Catch the thought, observe it, ask yourself, is this thought true? Is it helpful? Is it leading me toward peace, or pulling me away? And when it isn't helpful, let it go, let it float by like a cloud, then, gently return to what matters, to this moment, to this breath, to this life. Right thinking isn't something you master once, it's something you return to, again and again. Like coming home, and with time, your life begins to shift, not because the world changed, but because you did. By now, you've tasted the power of right thinking, you've learned to pause, to observe, to choose your thoughts with care, but still, the negative thoughts return, don't they? The old doubts, the quiet anger, the voice that whispers, you're not enough. They don't care. It's always going to be like this. Why do these thoughts cling so tightly? Why, despite all our wisdom, do we still suffer? Because the mind is conditioned. For years, maybe decades, it's been running on autopilot, feeding off fear. Replaying stories of the past, clinging to identities, grudges, expectations, and like a wheel, it spins, over and over, until you forget that you're the one turning it. This is the cycle of suffering, but here's the truth, you are not your thoughts, you are the awareness beneath them. The moment you begin to observe them, not obey them, you're already breaking free. So let's understand the nature of these negative thoughts. They're not your enemies, they're simply habits, mental echoes from wounds, fears, and misunderstandings. You don't defeat them by fighting, you dissolve them by understanding. This anger, where did it come from? This fear, what is it trying to protect me from? This judgment, is it rooted in pain? When you meet a negative thought with curiosity instead of condemnation, you reclaim your power. Try this. The next time you feel overwhelmed by a negative emotion, pause, breathe, and label it gently. This is fear. This is comparison. This is the mind trying to protect itself. Then ask, is this true? Is this helpful? Does this reflect who I want to be? This gap, this sacred pause between thought and reaction, is where freedom lives. You are no longer just a prisoner of old programs. You are the conscious witness, the awakened observer, the one who chooses. Of course, it won't be easy. The mind will pull you back, again and again, but every time you notice it, every time you return to presence, you're breaking another link in the chain, and slowly, the cycle weakens, and suffering softens, because suffering only survives in resistance, and awareness is the end of resistance. So let your path be gentle. Don't expect perfection, expect practice. Smile when you fall, because falling means you're awake enough to notice. And remember, a negative thought is not a failure, it's an invitation to return, to breathe, to choose again. This is the art of liberation, not in one grand moment, but in 1,000 quiet ones, one breath at a time, one thought at a time, one awakening at a time. So here we are, the final steps of our journey. But also, the beginning of something much deeper, a new way of living. You've walked through the landscapes of the mind, you've seen how thoughts shape your world, how they can bind you in suffering, or free you into clarity. You've learned that wisdom doesn't shout, it whispers beneath the noise, waiting for you. In stillness, in awareness, in each conscious breath. Right thinking is not a technique, it's not a belief, it's a return, a homecoming to what's always been within you. It's the knowing that, I am not my anger. I am not my fear. I am not even my story. You are the sky, the thoughts are just clouds. You are the stillness, the emotions are just passing waves, you are the awareness. Watching it all, and when you live from that space, from that clarity, you begin to live with true peace. You see, wisdom is not about having all the answers, it's about asking the right questions, and being still enough to hear what arises. Peace is not the absence of problems, it's the presence of understanding. Right thinking gives you that presence, that anchor, that light you can return to, again and again, when the world feels loud, when your thoughts pull you away, when pain knocks on your door. In those moments, pause, breathe, listen, and you will hear the quiet voice of truth that says, you are here. You are aware. And that is enough. That is freedom, that is wisdom, that is peace. So carry this practice into your life, not as something extra you must do, but as the way you live. Let your thoughts be guided by compassion, let your speech reflect clarity, let your actions arise from stillness, and when you fall, because you will, smile, begin again. Every breath is a new beginning. Right thinking is not the end of your path, it's the beginning of real presence. To live with wisdom is to walk gently through this world, to see clearly, to love fully, and to rest deeply in the peace that no one can give you, and no one can take away. It was always here, within you. Welcome home. Live wisely, live kindly, live free.